Today, Intelligent Systems is best known for developing popular series like Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and WarioWare. But before they were making games, they mainly worked with Nintendo and their partners on hardware and system tools. Today, developers have easy access to game engines like Unreal and Unity, but back in the NES days, such tools were not as widely available. In an episode of Iwata Asks, Super Smash Bros. Series director Masahiro Sakurai recounts his early days at HAL Laboratory, saying, "When I first joined HAL Laboratory, there were development tools for the NES, and all of them were labeled with the Intelligent Systems logo. Other companies developing NES software were also using development tools from Intelligent Systems. The studio also helped develop NES titles like Duck Hunt, Hogan's Alley, and Gyromite." After assisting with a number of ports, Intelligent Systems started shifting their studio's direction to become more software-focused, and began work on a war simulation game that would set the foundation for games to come. Famicom Wars was released in Japan on August 12, 1988 for the Nintendo Famicom. The player would take control of one of two factions, Red Star or Blue Moon. The overall objective was to completely wipe out the opposing faction over the course of 15 maps. 2 secret maps were also available depending on which faction the player chose. The player would claim victory over a map either when the entire opposing force was defeated or their headquarters was captured. Each faction took turns moving their troops, taking over buildings, attacking opposing troops, and building additional units. The player was given a set amount of money they could use to build additional units, and could gain more money with each new building they captured. There were 16 different unit types in total, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Tanks, for example, were strong in combat and could transport troops, but couldn't capture buildings. Foot soldiers, on the other hand, were weak against tanks, but could capture cities and buildings. By today's standards, the gameplay might seem rudimentary, but for the time it was quite deep and innovative. Famicom's Sunshin magazine, now known as Famitsu, gave Famicom Wars a score of 33 out of 40 and declared it one of the best games of all time in its 1989 Allsoft catalog issue. The game was considered a success and would spawn several sequels, including the first entry to release in the West, Advance Wars. After the release of Famicom Wars, Intelligent Systems wanted to create another simulation game, but move away from the war-based setting. This next title would combine the strategic gameplay of Famicom Wars with the story and characters of an RPG. Initially, the game exceeded the memory limitations of a Famicom cartridge, but after reallocating space typically meant for saving, the team was able to get it running. There was also a special chip loaded onto the cartridge that would allow it to display Japanese text. Little did Intelligent Systems know that their next game, never originally meant to be a commercial release, would go on to become the biggest franchise in the company's history. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was released in Japan on April 20th, 1990 for the Nintendo Famicom. The original concept was created by Shozo Kaga, who also served as a scenario writer and designer. Keisuke Terasaki helmed the project as director, with longtime Nintendo veteran Gunpei Yokoi serving as producer, and Yuka Tsujioko penning the musical score. The story followed the adventures of Marth, Prince of Altea, and his journey to reclaim his throne. At a young age, Marth's family was killed and he was forced to flee to the neighboring island nation of Talos. Several years later, Marth proved his worth in battle by staving off a group of invading pirates. He then set off on a journey to liberate the world from the same group that killed his family, joined by a small band of soldiers and the princess of Talos, Sita. Along the way, Marth is given the titular Fire Emblem, a legendary shield meant to be given to the one destined to save the world. After Marth used it to free his home of Altea, he learns that his sister Elise is still alive and being held captive by an evil wizard named Garnith. Garnith had resurrected the ancient shadow dragon Medeus, with plans to conquer the world. After obtaining the powerful Starlight Tome and reclaiming his father's sword Falchion, Marth defeats the evil fiends, rescues his sister Elise, and restores peace to the land once again. If the player managed to keep Sita alive to the end of the game, an extra scene played out where Marth and her would confess their love for each other. Through the course of the game, the player also encounters the divine dragon Tiki, who could take the form of a young girl. Tiki would return in several sequels and is one of the most widely recognized characters in the franchise. Gameplay was similar in many ways to Famicom Wars. The game was broken up into a series of grid-based maps that the player would battle through in a turn-based fashion. The player would claim victory in a variety of ways, mainly through defeating certain boss characters. Unlike Famicom Wars though, there was no money to spend on training troops each turn. Every troop was deployed at the beginning of each battle, and it was all about the combat. There were 25 total characters to recruit and 21 different character classes available through the game. One mechanic that would become a staple of the franchise was permadeath. If a character fell in battle, they could not be revived and were gone for the rest of the game. If Marth died, it was game over. This created an increased sense of tension as players didn't want to lose their favorite characters. Permadeath certainly made for a challenging but also highly rewarding experience. Through the course of battles, characters could earn experience points and upgrade their gear throughout the game. Once a character earned enough XP, they would level up and their stats would increase. There were also shops and vendors throughout the world that would sell better gear for your troops. At launch, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was not well received and did not sell particularly well. Japanese outlets gave the game low scores due to its poor graphics and steep learning curve. Players, however, did not share the same opinion. Sales flattened after around 2 months, but after a glowing Famitsu column and word of mouth amongst players spread, sales picked back up. As of 2002, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light has sold nearly 330,000 copies and got re-released on Nintendo's Virtual Console for Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. The Famicom version was never released outside of Japan. However, the game did receive 3 remakes, the latter of which finally did see a worldwide release. For intelligent systems, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was just their next game, but for other Japanese game developers, it was an inspiration. As a series, Fire Emblem is credited with not only popularizing the strategy RPG genre, but also for inspiring other franchises like Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Disgaea. Following the commercial success of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, development of a sequel began aiming to address some of the game's criticisms. The game was given the subtitle of Gaiden, which in Japanese refers to a side story. This was appropriate as this next game was highly experimental, with many of the new gameplay systems introduced not returning for future sequels. Fire Emblem Gaiden was released in Japan for the Nintendo Famicom on March 14, 1992. Shozo Kaga was elevated to director for the project, as well as assuming his designing and writing roles. Gunpei Yokoi returned as a producer along with Yuka Tsujioko to write the music. The story takes place on the continent of Valentia, where 2 nations, Zofia and Rigel, are torn apart by their respective gods, Milla and Duma. Fire Emblem Gaiden was a dual protagonist story, following childhood friends Alm and Celica. After being separated at a young age, many years go by and they each set out on their own journey, which cross paths throughout the game. Alm looks to push out Rigel's invading army, led by Emperor Rudolph, while Celica is in search of the goddess Milla, who has gone missing. Near the end of the game, Alm finally confronts and defeats Emperor Rudolph in battle. In his final words, Rudolph shares with Alm that his birth name is actually Albin Alm Rudolph, and that he is the Emperor's son. It's also revealed through the story that Celica's real name is Anthis, and the Princess of Zofia, making the 2 protagonists the royal heirs to their respective countries. All story points converge at Duma Temple, where Alm and Celica reunite to defeat Duma, causing Duma and Milla to leave the world forever. In the end, Alm and Celica get married and unite their nations under one rule for all of Valentia. Despite Gaiden having 2 protagonists, Alm and Celica's armies did not fight together, but instead would fight separately with their own paths through the story. The player could navigate the world with each army, not just through different battles, but also dungeons and towns. At towns, players could explore, recruit new characters, buy new equipment, and even swap items between armies through a special vendor. A few other additions were added to Gaiden on top of exploration. Character classes were not set in stone, but could be upgraded to more powerful ones once the character reached a certain level. Alm, for example, could graduate from the fighter class to the hero class. Spells would also consume a portion of the caster's health, adding yet another layer of strategy. As time has passed, Fire Emblem Gaiden is looked back on as the black sheep of the series, with many comparing it to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link and Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest due to its experimental nature. It was, however, fairly well received, with Famitsu giving the game a score of 28 out of 40, and as of 2002 had sold just shy of 325,000 copies. It also released on Nintendo's Virtual Console in Japan for the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. Gaiden would also get its own remake decades later on the 3DS. Fire Emblem had established itself as a strong franchise for Nintendo, but Kaga wasn't satisfied. The first 2 games both took place on the continent of Arcanea, and Kaga wanted to expand the story beyond that constraint. For the next game in the series, he wanted to tell a more grand-scale story spanning across generations. His ambition, among other hardships, made for a more prolonged and rocky development. For starters, there was a staff change which took time for new members to catch up. A large number of staff members also moved offices, further delaying the project. The gameplay elements had changed so many times through development that at one point it wasn't even going to be a Fire Emblem game. Toru Narahiro, one of the game's staff members, estimated that the game was probably remade 2 or 3 times from the prototype stage to the final release. Originally announced as Inheritors of Light, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War was easily one of the most innovative titles in the series. Many of its new game systems like Romance, a Home Base, and the Weapon Triangle would go on to become franchise staples for years to come. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War was released in Japan for the Nintendo Super Famicom on May 14, 1996. Kaga, Yokoi, and Tsujioko all returned to their respective roles, although this would be the last Fire Emblem game that Gunpei Yokoi would serve as producer. Genealogy of the Holy War took place on the continent of Jugdril, made up of 8 countries, which were founded by the 12 Crusaders. These 12 Crusaders defeated Loptir, an ancient dragon who ruled over the world. Genealogy of the Holy War picks up over 100 years later and tells the story of Sigurd and Selef, a father and son trying to stop a group from resurrecting Loptir. The story was a grand one, not told over the course of a few months or years, but over decades. Genealogy of the Holy War included several provocative story elements like the death of a protagonist, possession, and incest. In the first act of the game, Sigurd falls in love with and marries Deirdre, a descendant of one of the 12 Crusaders powerful enough to defeat Loptir. Together, they have a son, Selef. The Loptir sect kidnaps Deirdre with the intention of using her to help revive Loptir. They have her memories erased and plan to have her marry Lord Arvis, her half-brother. The goal was for Arvis and Deirdre to have a child powerful enough to serve as a host for the resurrected Loptir. As Sigurd fights his way to rescue Deirdre, he learns that Arvis has married her, making him King of Granvale. Arvis then has all of Sigurd's troops executed and killed Sigurd himself. The Yide Massacre was one of the most shocking plot twists in a video game at the time and still looms over the series today. Act 2 picks up many years later, with Deirdre having given birth to twins, Julius and Julia. Julius would serve as the vessel for Loptir, eventually overthrowing his father. Deirdre would later sacrifice herself to teleport Julia away to safety. Selef would eventually emerge from hiding, and along with the help of Julia, team up with the children of his father's companions to overthrow Julius's tyrannical regime. The turn-based tactical combat and victory conditions followed series tradition, but this time you had a home base to come back to. You could enter bases before and during missions to perform tasks like repairing weapons and buying items. One of the biggest innovations for Genealogy of the Holy War was the Weapon Triangle. The Weapon Triangle was inspired by rock, paper, scissors, where certain weapons were strong and weak to each other. In this case, lances beat swords, swords beat axes, and axes beat lances. A similar system was also added for magic. The Weapon Triangle added an extra layer of strategy as the player had to be mindful not to leave their troops in vulnerable spots on the map. Another huge mechanic was the romance system. Dialogue sequences would trigger on maps or through story moments that had characters fall in love and eventually have children. Characters that were in relationships benefited from fighting together as they gave each other stat boosts during combat. What was neat is that the way these romances played out had a direct impact on stats and abilities for their children in the second act of the game. There was another similar system called Leadership Rank where certain high-level units could give stat boosts to nearby troops. Intelligence Systems had another hit on their hands with Genealogy of the Holy War selling nearly 500,000 copies. The game was praised for its epic story and customization, with many considering it one of the best entries in the series. It eventually released for Nintendo's Virtual Console on Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, but is still not seen in official release outside of Japan. Only a month after the release of Genealogy of the Holy War, Nintendo launched their next home console, the Nintendo 64. It touted breathtaking 3D visuals for the time, and launched with the classic platformer Super Mario 64. A year later, Shigeru Miyamoto announced that a new Fire Emblem title was in development for the system, aptly named Fire Emblem 64. However, the project was cancelled years later due to structural changes at Intelligence Systems and poor sales of the Nintendo 64 disk drive add-on. Internally, it was given the subtitle of Maiden of Darkness, the original subtitle given to Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. Interestingly, the work put into Fire Emblem 64 would serve as the basis for the Binding Blade years later on the Game Boy Advance. Most of the characters and story did not carry over, However, the main character Roy did. Originally, Roy was given the name Ike, a name that would be given to a different protagonist in a future sequel. In 1998, development of the last Super Famicom Fire Emblem title began. It was initially meant to be a small side story set between the two acts of Genealogy of the Holy War. However, the scope grew and pushed the release back far beyond what was originally intended. This would also serve as the final Fire Emblem title that Kaga would work on before leaving Intelligent Systems. Fire Emblem Thracia 776 was first released in Japan for the Nintendo Power Flash cartridge on September 1st, 1999. This was a Japan-only peripheral that allowed users to download Super Famicom and Game Boy games at a lower price point than a typical cartridge. Thracia 776 would later release on the Nintendo Super Famicom on January 21st, 2000. Kaga and Tsuchiyoko returned to their respective roles, with Takahiro Izushi producing and Mayumi Hirota returning from Genealogy of the Holy War as character designer. Thracia 776 takes place during Act 2 of Genealogy of the Holy War, and follows the plight of Leif, heir to the Republic of Manster. Leif had been on the run most of his life, but after seeing a village get decimated and his friends captured, he decides to fight back against the Kingdom of Thracia. Aided by his friend Finn, Leif amasses a loyal group of rebels, pushes out the forces of Thracia, and restores peace to his land. In terms of gameplay, Thracia 776 evolved the least compared to its predecessors. The tactical combat remained familiar, however victory conditions expanded beyond defeating enemies to objectives like rescuing certain units or escaping a map unharmed. One new mechanic was a Fog of War, where players could not see certain sections of the map until their units were within range. There was also a fatigue mechanic, where characters would lose stamina for various actions like attacking or opening chests. If a character became too fatigued, they would not be available for the next chapter. All these mechanics combined to make the game brutally difficult, with Thracia 776 widely considered to be the hardest game in the series. Despite receiving positive reviews, Thracia 776 was not a big seller. Estimates given have the sales somewhere between 106,000 and 145,000, making it the lowest selling entry in the franchise thus far. One major factor was Nintendo's big competition, the PlayStation. By the time Thracia 776 released for the Super Famicom, the PlayStation had already been out for over 5 years in Japan. The PlayStation quickly became home to some of the greatest RPGs of all time, and players had long since moved on. The years following the release of Thracia 776 would prove to be quite turbulent, not only for Intelligent Systems, but the series as a whole. Series creator Shozo Kaga would leave Intelligent Systems in 1999, and in 2000 form his own studio, Tirnanog. Shortly after, he announced that the studio's first project, titled Emblem Saga, was in development for Nintendo's biggest rival, the Sony PlayStation. To the uninitiated, Emblem Saga seemed nearly indistinguishable from Fire Emblem, employing a similar tactical combat style and even using similar character designs from Mayumi Hirota. Kaga made no attempt to disguise its similarities to Fire Emblem, and Nintendo was not pleased. Nintendo would sue Tirnanog and its publishing partner Enterbrain a total of 3 times, going as high up as the Japanese Supreme Court, claiming this was an infringement on copyrights. In the end, Tirnanog was forced to change the game's name, eventually settling on Tearing Saga, and Enterbrain was ordered to pay Nintendo a fee of 76 million yen. In the end, Nintendo could not stop the game from releasing, and on May 21, 2001, Tearing Saga hit store shelves in Japan. The game was considered a success, garnering a score of 32 out of 40 from Famitsu, and went on to sell over 340,000 copies. Much like past Fire Emblem titles, however, it never saw a release outside of Japan. Tirnanog would release a sequel in 2005 for the PlayStation 2 titled Tearing Saga Berwick Saga, but sales were not quite as high, and it was ultimately the last game for the series in the studio. Dealing with the departure of Kaga and canceling Fire Emblem 64 in 2000 left the Fire Emblem series in a fractured state. It wasn't clear which direction the series would go next, or even on what platform. Despite releasing highly acclaimed titles like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64, the Nintendo 64 was not the massive hit Nintendo was hoping it would be. The major culprit was the game cartridges, which were expensive to produce and ultimately led longtime development partners to flee to Sony's PlayStation. In the end, the PlayStation would outsell the Nintendo 64 over 3-1, but Nintendo had its sights set on its next handheld console, the Game Boy Advance. It touted technical power that exceeded the Super Famicom, and a wider array of colors than the Game Boy. Taking everything they learned up until this point and salvaging what they could from Fire Emblem 64, Intelligent Systems would release the next entry in the series on a portable system for the very first time. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade was released in Japan for the Game Boy Advance on March 29, 2002. Toru Narihiro was elevated to director for the project, with Takahiro Izushi and Yuka Sugioka returning for their normal duties and Eiji Kaneda designing the characters. Much like past Fire Emblem entries, the story deals with the return of an ancient evil and heroes from the past. The plot begins on the continent of Alib and follows the adventures of Roy, the son of Eliwood, who serves as the Marquis to the region of Foray. Eliwood fell ill, and it was up to Roy to lead an army to push back the invading forces. One of the central plot elements of the Binding Blade were the 8 divine weapons, legendary items used to banish dragons over 1,000 years ago. The titular Binding Blade was an even more powerful weapon that Roy discovers through the course of the story. The Fire Emblem also made a return that, when combined with the Binding Blade, gave Roy incredible power. The story of the Binding Blade was unique in that it had several branching points depending on the actions of the player. The game culminated with a battle against King Zephiel, the ruler of Bern. However, if the player had collected all 8 divine weapons through the course of the game continued beyond this point, and the true history of Alib would be revealed. Roy learned that the dragons of ancient times reproduced at a much slower rate than humans, and their numbers slowly dwindled. In a move of desperation, the dragons enslaved a divine dragon named Idun, who was able to reproduce dragons at a much faster rate. Having been sealed away for hundreds of years, Zephiel released Idun to wreak havoc on the world. Ultimately, Roy and his army were able to defeat Idun and restore peace to Alib. Through the story, Roy would meet a woman named Lelina from the region of Ostia. Lelina's father, Hector, was friends with Roy's father, Eliwood, and would play a prominent role in a future prequel. Gameplay for the Binding Blade remained largely unchanged from previous titles. Signature elements like the grid-based combat, permadeath, and the weapon triangle all made a return. The emphasis was clearly on polishing the systems created in past titles. The difficulty was also lowered to make it more approachable for players. The Binding Blade put the series back on track, selling over 100,000 copies in its first week, and going on to sell nearly 350,000 in total. It later released for Nintendo's Virtual Console on Wii U, but to this day still remains a Japan exclusive. After 6 releases over the course of 12 years, Fire Emblem had firmly established itself as a staple Nintendo franchise. The only problem is that the rest of the world had never heard of it. That is until Nintendo released its smash hit fighting game for the GameCube. On December 3rd, 2001, Nintendo released Super Smash Bros. Melee in North America for the Nintendo GameCube. It was a fighting game whose roster was made up entirely of Nintendo mascots like Mario, Link, and Pikachu. Melee was so wildly popular that it went on to become the best-selling game for the system, selling over 7 million copies. Western audiences were mostly familiar with the roster of characters outside of 2 unknown newcomers, Marth and Roy. Players would later learn that they were characters from the Fire Emblem franchise, which prompted greater interest from audiences outside of Japan. This, coupled with the success of Advance Wars in the West, prompted Nintendo to localize the next sequel, allowing the rest of the world to finally experience Intelligent Systems' landmark role-playing series for the first time. Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, simply titled Fire Emblem in the West, was released for the Game Boy Advance on April 25, 2003 in Japan, and November 3, 2003 in North America. Teiko Kaneda and Kentaro Nishimura would split directing duties. Narihiro and Izushi returned as producers, Sugioka continued her musical duties, and Sachiko Wada would design the characters. Fire Emblem is actually a prequel to The Binding Blade, taking place 20 years prior. In a series first, the main protagonist is not actually a playable character, but rather an off-screen one that issues orders to characters in battle known as the Tactician. To begin the game, the Tactician quickly joins forces with Lyn, one of the main characters. Lyn discovers that she is the heir apparent to Kaelin, and sets out on a journey to stop her great-uncle Lundgren from wrongly assuming the throne. Later, the party joins up with the Lycian lords Hector, Eliwood, and their party. A group known as the Black Fang is causing chaos and is being manipulated by a mysterious character named Nurgle. His true aim is to open a portal, allowing dragons to invade and cause massive destruction. The party is able to defeat Nurgle and his summoned dragon, with Eliwood then ascending to the role of Marquis of Foray, and Hector taking over his brother's position as Marquis of Ostia. Fire Emblem actually had a secret ending, where Hector and Eliwood are shown at a much older age, introducing their children Roy and Alina to one another. There was even an extended epilogue exclusive to the NTSC regions, which showed Zephiel as an adult, directly leading up to the events of Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. Fire Emblem took a greatest hits approach from past entries, including Fog of War, the Weapon Triangle, and Permadeath. Most characters would be lost for the game if they fell in combat. However, if main characters Lyn, Hector, or Eliwood died, then it was game over and the player would have to try the battle again. And a first for the series, a multiplayer mode called Link Arena was added. In this mode, players could either battle with up to 5 characters against their own AI-controlled army, or battle with up to 3 other players with characters from the main story. Victory was achieved either by surviving long enough or accumulating the most points. The reception to Fire Emblem in the West was highly positive, being praised by fans and critics alike. IGN called it incredibly challenging and fulfilling, with GameSpot declaring it a compelling, character-driven epic. Today, Fire Emblem sits at a Metacritic score of 88, the third highest in the series. To this day, there's still no definitive sales figures, but in an interview with Nindori, the developers said that it was a success overseas, which gave them confidence to return to home console for future entries. Fire Emblem also released worldwide for the Wii U Virtual Console in 2014. The development team at Intelligent Systems immediately began work on the next game in the series, which would be released for the GameCube. However, there was one last team simultaneously working on one last entry for the Game Boy Advance. This came as a bit of a surprise to the staff, not only because they didn't think they would be working with the Game Boy Advance anymore, but also because Nintendo's next handheld, the DS, was right around the corner. Despite this, the development team was able to release the game rather quickly, and it served as a bit of a tribute to the second game of the series, Fire Emblem Gaiden. Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones was released for the Game Boy Advance on October 7, 2004 in Japan, and May 23, 2005 in North America. Sachiko Wada was elevated to director for this game, as well as continuing her duties as character designer. Toru Narihiro would return to produce along with Hitoshi Yamagami, as well as Kohei Maeda and Saki Haruyama reprising their respective roles. Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones takes place on the continent of Magville, where 6 nations reside. 5 of those nations were entrusted to watch over powerful gemstones called the Sacred Stones, items used to seal away a powerful demon king hundreds of years ago known as Famortis. When the game begins, the largest of those 5 nations, Grotto, launches a surprise attack on the nation of Renee, home of the game's 2 protagonists, Erika and Ephraim. Renee is defeated and the 2 siblings are forced to flee to different corners of Magville. Erika retreats to Frelia in the north with Seth, the king's general, and Ephraim heads south to mount a resistance. After reuniting later in the story, it's revealed that Grotto's aim is to destroy all the Sacred Stones and release Famortis. Erika and Ephraim split up once again to warn the other nations still guarding their respective Sacred Stones. After several failed attempts, the siblings only manage to save 1 Sacred Stone, and in turn give chase to their former friend Lion, in a desperate attempt to stop Famortis for good. In the end, Erika and Ephraim manage to seal away the Demon King's soul, destroy his body, and return to Renee to rebuild their home. The narrative was a branching one, telling the story from 2 perspectives, much like Fire Emblem Gaiden. Also like Gaiden was the return of an explorable world map, allowing the player to engage with the next story mission at their leisure. The difficulty was much more manageable as well, thanks to the Tower of Valny and the Lagdao Ruins, maps that essentially let the player grind as long as they wanted to. The main gameplay was generally the same as the past few entries, as it was running on the same engine. There were, however, a few new mechanics to shake things up. The first few revolved around character classes. Instead of progressing to the next class after reaching a certain level, you could choose from a few options. For example, a Myrmidon could be promoted to either an assassin or a swordmaster. There was also the addition of training units, which started at a lower level than normal, but leveled up faster. The multiplayer mode Link Arena made a return as well, as the addition of a new post-game mode called Creature Campaign. After completing the game, the player could carry their save file over to this mode and wander around the world map at their leisure. There was no additional story content. However, there were several characters you could recruit that were exclusive to this mode, including villains from the main story. The reception to the Sacred Stones from critics was positive, but not quite as strong as Fire Emblem. Most praised the game's story, with Eurogamer mentioning that the storytelling is wonderful, and OneUp.com praising the game for having a compelling story and fantastic array of unique characters. Today, the Sacred Stone sits at a commendable Metacritic score of 85 out of 100. It also saw a release for Wii U's Virtual Console and was included in Nintendo's 3DS Ambassador Program, an initiative that rewarded early adopters of the 3DS with free games during a time when the system was selling far below Nintendo's expectations. To this day, this is still the only official way to play the Sacred Stones on 3DS. Fire Emblem had proven to be a success in the West, giving the team at Intelligent Systems the confidence to bring the series to the GameCube. This next title took nearly 2 full years to develop and would be their most ambitious game yet. It was finally time for Fire Emblem to make its return to home consoles after nearly 6 years. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance was released for the Nintendo GameCube on April 20th, 2005 in Japan, and October 17th, 2005 in North America. Masayuki Horikawa would lead the project as director. Naruhiro and Yamagami would return to produce, series newcomer Senri Kita would design the characters, a team of familiar faces would pen the score, and late Nintendo CEO Satoru Iwata lent his hand as executive producer. The story of Path of Radiance was made more compelling thanks to the boost in technology. The game not only made the jump from 2D to 3D, but also included CG cutscenes and voice acting for the first time in the series.
That song.
Ah, you're up. About time.
The plot centers around Ike, the son of a mercenary leader named Grail. Near the beginning of the game, Ike rescues a woman while on a mission. This woman is later revealed to be Alincia Riddell Crimea, the princess and rightful heir to the Crimean throne. Alincia was driven from her home by the Dane Empire, led by their king, Ashnard. Most of the story revolves around Ike and his band of mercenaries trying to mend relationships that have been torn apart by racial tensions. The humanoid Bjork and the beast-like Laguz have never really got along and have been engulfed in conflict for years. Ike is able to mend a number of broken relationships through the game, and unite them together against Ashnard, their true enemy. It's later revealed that Ashnard's true aim is to use Laron's Medallion, this world's version of the titular Fire Emblem, to release a long-dormant evil. Thankfully, Ike and his band of mercenaries are able to defeat Ashnard, and Alincia can take her rightful place on the throne to help further mend the wounds between Bjork and Laguz. Character classes got a slight alteration in Path of Radiance. Instead of letting the player choose, characters were automatically promoted to a new class once they hit level 21. If you had a Master Seal, you could promote a character at level 10. The Laguz were a new playable class that had a unique transformation gauge. Once this filled up, the character could transform into their animal form for a limited period of time and receive increased stats. There was also a base you could spend time at in between battles. Here, the player could manage their characters, engage in support conversations, and divvy up bonus experience earned through battles. This would help level up weaker troops that weren't as high level or even further boost your strongest units. Initially, Path of Radiance was received quite well. It sold over 100,000 units its first week in Japan and topped the GameCube charts its first week in the UK. Its Metacritic score today sits at a commendable 85 out of 100. Despite all this, the team at Intelligent Systems had higher sales ambitions. In an interview with Nindori, the team lamented the fact that Path of Radiance released so late in the lifespan of the GameCube. Much like with Fire Emblem on Game Boy Advance, Nintendo's next home console, the Wii, was right around the corner. It seemed like the timing continued to be off for the Fire Emblem series. It got so bad, in fact, that the Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance actually released the exact same day on November 4th, 2005 in Europe. Despite less than stellar sales, Path of Radiance is still considered a fan favorite and commands outrageous prices due to its low print run. To this day, it has not seen any kind of re-release or remaster. The team at Intelligent Systems believed that Fire Emblem was best suited to release earlier in a console's lifespan, in order to push new hardware. With that in mind, they quickly began work on a sequel for the Nintendo Wii. Though with new hardware came new technology and higher development costs. To best take advantage of the Wii's capabilities, the development team doubled in size from Path of Radiance to around 200. This was Intelligent Systems' chance to pair everything they had learned up until that point with the right timing they had been waiting for. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn was released for the Nintendo Wii on February 22, 2007 in Japan, and November 7, 2007 in North America. Taiko Kaneda returned to the director's chair. Naruhiro, Yamagami, and Kita returned to their respective roles, and the team of Yoshida Hirano, Chika Sekigawa, and Naoko Mitomi composed the music. Radiant Dawn was a direct sequel to Path of Radiance, taking place 3 years after. The story was one of the longest in the series, spanning 4 distinct parts. Part 1 deals with the oppression of Dane after falling to Crimea in the Mad King's War. A resistance group called the Dawn Brigade, led by the silver-haired Micaiah, sought to retake their land. Part 2 focused on Crimea and their new inexperienced queen Alincia. The people of Crimea got word of the Dane rebellion and fear that they may return to invade Crimea again. As uncertainty began to grow, rumblings of a coup led by Count Ludwig spread through the empire. Before his plan could fully come to fruition, Ike and the Grail mercenaries arrived just in time to stave off the rebellion and reunite with Queen Alincia. Part 3 revolved around the people of Telia stopping the release of the goddess Yun. Unfortunately, both Yun and the goddess of order Ashera were released. To punish the people of Telius for bringing the world into chaos, Ashera petrifies nearly every citizen with only a few strong warriors surviving. Part 4 was the climactic finale as the united forces led by King Tabarn, Ike, and Micaiah marched on the Tower of Guidance to defeat Ashera and free the people of Telius. Despite being released for the Wii, Radiant Dawn did not take advantage of any of its motion control capabilities, as the development team felt it was unnecessary. A notable addition to the gameplay was terrain height. Depending on where a character stood compared to their enemy, they could receive advantages or disadvantages. For example, characters on higher terrain would have increased accuracy and power. If a player had a GameCube memory card, they could transfer their save data and receive increased stats for their characters. There was, however, a notable bug for the North American version. If a player transferred a Path of Radiance save file in easy mode, the game would freeze. Due to the Wii's limited online capabilities, the game could not be patched, and the only way to fix the bug was for players to mail in their copy to Nintendo and receive a fixed copy in return. While Radiant Dawn did receive its fair share of positive reviews, the reception overall was not what Intelligent Systems hoped it would be. Many critics panned the game for its brutal difficulty and less than stellar presentation. By 2007, games like BioShock, Uncharted, and Mario Galaxy were releasing, and Radiant Dawn simply couldn't compete. Radiant Dawn needed to be a big seller due to its high production cost, but in the end, it was one of the lowest selling entries in franchise history. Intelligent Systems would go on to release 2 remakes for the DS in the wake of Radiant Dawn, but things were not looking good for the future of Fire Emblem. The move to home consoles did not result in the increased sales Nintendo wanted. In fact, the sales were so bad that Nintendo laid down a decree. If the next mainline Fire Emblem game did not sell at least 250,000 copies, it would be the final game for the franchise. During 2011's Tokyo Game Show, it was announced that the next mainline entry in the Fire Emblem franchise would be released for Nintendo's latest handheld system, the 3DS. This was Intelligent Systems' last chance to make Fire Emblem the hit franchise they knew it could be. The goal was clear: sell at least 250,000 copies or it would mean the end of the franchise. With this in mind, the development team set out to make the most feature-rich game yet. At one point, the team tossed around wild ideas like placing the game in a modern setting or even on the planet Mars. Ultimately, the team thought it best to keep to the series' roots and remain in a medieval fantasy setting. Intelligent Systems put everything they had into this game, and it ultimately paid off, as it would be remembered as the savior of the franchise. Fire Emblem Awakening was released for the Nintendo 3DS on April 19, 2012 in Japan, and nearly a year later on February 4, 2013 in North America. Kohei Maeda was elevated to director along with Genki Yokoro. Naruhiro and Yamagami once again returned to produce. Newcomer Yusuke Kozaki designed the characters, and the team of Hiroki Morishita and Rei Kondo composed the music. For the first time in the West, players could customize an avatar character, both in looks and gender. By default, the character's name was Robin, but players could also change this to one of their choosing. Fire Emblem Awakening took place 2,000 years after and in the same world as the very first game in the series. This included familiar elements like the Falchion, a character named Marth, and the titular Fire Emblem. Awakening's story began with an ominous dream where Robin killed an unknown swordsman, only to be awoken moments later by the very same one. The swordsman introduced himself as Crom, leader of the Ylese military group the Shepherds. Crom was joined by his spunky sister Lissa and the stern knight Frederick. Most of Awakening's plot centered around protecting the powerful Fire Emblem from enemy threats and stopping the resurrection of the fell dragon Grima. A mysterious character calling themselves Marth appeared periodically throughout the game. Marth claimed to know the future and attempted to warn the Shepherds of the looming threat. It was later revealed that Marth was not only a woman, but Crom's daughter from the future named Lucina. In Lucina's timeline, Grima was resurrected and she's traveled back to the past to prevent history from repeating itself. Fire Emblem Awakening's gameplay was the perfect combination of great mechanics from the past along with a host of new ones. Returning features included a traversable world map, branching character promotion, and for the first time for Western players, a casual mode. Casual mode allowed players to bring back fallen allies after battle instead of losing them for the rest of the game. To help players connect with the characters more, the duel up and pair systems were introduced. The duel system gave stat bonuses to characters that stood on adjacent squares, which could increase depending on their support rank with one another. The pair-up system would allow two characters to occupy the same square and provide assistance to one another. For example, a character could provide a follow-up attack or block an incoming one. The inclusion of marriage and children also made a return from Genealogy of the Holy War. Instead of waiting years for the children to grow up, they could become immediately playable through time travel. Depending on who you courted, you could have varying relations to Lucina, either by being her mother by marrying Crom, or marrying her and becoming her husband. Additionally, there are a number of alternate endings depending on which choice you make. In the last battle, if Crom deals the final blow, it puts Grima into a 1,000-year rest. However, if Robin deals the final blow, they both fade away, only for Robin to return later, in a scene that closely mirrors the opening of the game. In every regard, Fire Emblem Awakening was a smash hit. It needed to sell at least 250,000 copies to keep the series alive, and nearly did so the first week in Japan alone, selling over 240,000 copies. It also had the best first month sales in franchise history for North America, and to this day is still the best-selling entry for the region. Critical reception was equally high, with the game garnering a Metacritic score of 92 out of 100, still the highest rating in franchise history. Awakening was, however, a watershed moment for players, dividing the fanbase. A host of new fans discovered and fell in love with the franchise for the first time. Many attribute this to the lower difficulty thanks to the inclusion of casual mode, a likable cast of characters, and the ability to learn more about the characters through the support system. Longtime fans lamented the release of Awakening as they felt it casualized the series and made it too easy. Regardless of how anyone felt, Awakening remains among the most popular entries, and will forever be remembered for saving the franchise. After the runaway success of Awakening, a sequel was immediately greenlit by Nintendo. This came as a bit of a surprise to the development team at Intelligent Systems, as they made Awakening with the mindset that it would be the final game for the series. To try and build on their success, the main staff from Awakening returned, along with the help of Nintendo's software planning and development division. Announced during a Nintendo Direct in January of 2015, this next entry would include many elements that made Awakening successful, and was also quite ambitious by taking a page out of Nintendo's own Pokemon franchise. Fire Emblem Fates, titled Fire Emblem If in Japan, was released for the Nintendo 3DS on June 25, 2015 in Japan, and February 19, 2016 in North America. Nearly every key member from Awakening returned to their respective roles. Fate's plot was unlike any in the series. The Avatar character named Corrin by default was born in the land of Hoshido, but kidnapped and raised by the royal family in Noor. In an attempt to rescue Corrin, Hoshido end up capturing a Noor princess named Azura and raise her as their own. Early on in the story, Corrin's two families encounter each other on the battlefield, and the player was forced to side with one of the two families. Each route was not only a branch in the story, but its own separate game. Depending on which family the player sided with, the other would see it as a sign of betrayal and would slowly grow to fight them through the game. Fire Emblem Fate's Birthright had Corrin side with his birth family from Hoshido and reunite with his siblings Sakura, Hinoka, Takumi, and Ryoma. This route mainly deals with Corrin fending off Noor's invasion of Hoshido. In Fire Emblem Fate's Conquest, Corrin sides with Noor and fights alongside their adoptive siblings Elise, Camilla, Leo, and Xander. This route centers around Corrin trying to change Noor's wicked ways and supplant their evil king Garen. A third route was released shortly after launch via DLC titled Fire Emblem Fates Revelation. In the Revelation route, coincides with neither family and flees with Azura. The two discover a dark secret that threatens the world, and they must unite both families to fend off the greater threat. This is also the only route where the Fire Emblem is included in the story. Gameplay remained largely the same with the addition of Hoshiden versions of familiar weapons like katanas for swords and yumis for bows. These new weapons were also accounted for in the weapon triangle. A new feature added to Fates was My Castle. Here, the player could build up shops, engage in supplemental battles, and spend time with characters to increase their support levels. Shops at the castle could be leveled up and would sell increasingly better equipment. You could also have more intimate moments with your characters at your quarters. However, that functionality was severely edited for the release outside of Japan. Tapping was limited to waking up your spouse, but interactions with other characters in your quarters was left in. Fates also received a few visual upgrades from Awakening, most notably the inclusion of feet for character models. This was a big sticking point from Awakening that fans were pleased to see addressed. Armor also received visual damage to it the more a character got hit. To make Fates even more approachable, a new mode called Phoenix Mode was added. In this mode, fallen allies would revive the following turn instead of after battle, or in the case of Classic Mode, not at all. Fire Emblem Fates was another success, building off the positive reception of Awakening. Critics seemed to enjoy it, with a combined Metacritic score of all versions sitting at an 88 out of 100. Fans enjoyed it as well, with newer fans leaning towards the Birthright route and older fans appreciating the more challenging Conquest route. Having multiple versions likely helped to boost sales, with Fates reaching even higher numbers than Awakening. Estimates have Fire Emblem Fates at around 3 million copies sold, not only making it the best-selling game in the franchise, but also the best-selling strategy RPG of all time. The previous record belonged to Final Fantasy Tactics at 2.4 million copies sold. With the success of Awakening and Fates, Fire Emblem was not only back, but here to stay. In 2015, concept development began for the next mainline entry, which was subsequently put on hold until development of Shadows of Valentia, a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden, was completed. During this time, Intelligent Systems got wind of Nintendo's upcoming hybrid system, the Switch, and decided to release their next game there instead of the 3DS. Admittedly, the team struggled with developing a game in high definition, a first for the series, and sought out additional help. Dynasty Warriors developer Koei Tecmo was brought on board to assist, as they had recently worked on the spin-off title Fire Emblem Warriors. This next game's director, Toshiyuki Kusikihara, admitted that the game would not have been possible without their assistance. With Koei Tecmo's additional expertise, the stage was set for this to be the biggest entry yet. There were, however, a few hitches along the way. The game was originally announced at a Fire Emblem Direct in 2017. However, the game would be delayed twice, eventually settling on a July 2019 release window. The extra time was well worth it, as the game made a big splash in its return to home consoles. Fire Emblem Three Houses was released worldwide for the Nintendo Switch on July 26, 2019, a first for the series. Genki Yokoto returned to direct, alongside Toshiyuki Kusikihara. Hitoshi Yamagami was joined by Masahiro Higuchi to produce. Chinatsu Kurahana of Utano Prince-sama fame would design the characters, with Hiroki Morishita and Rei Kondo returning alongside Takuro Kanazaki to compose the music. In Three Houses, you took up arms as Byleth, the child of a mercenary group leader named Gerald. Early on, the pair save a trio of young warriors being attacked by a group of bandits, only to realize they were all royal heirs to their respective nations. The three also shared that they were students attending the nearby Officers' Academy at Garruk Monastery. After escorting them back, you're quickly offered a teaching position as there happens to be a need. One of the other professors, Manuela, explains to Byleth that the school's broken up into 3 separate houses. The Black Eagles, led by Edelgard of the Adrestian Empire, the Blue Lions, led by Dimitri of the Holy Kingdom of Fargus, and the Golden Deer, led by Claude of the Leicester Alliance. Each of the 3 houses are occupied by students hailing from their respective nation. Byleth is then given the choice of which house to teach, each having a unique cast of characters and differing plot points. Early on, there's inklings of a bigger plot brewing, including hints from the enigmatic Sophis. She speaks to Byleth telepathically, but her origins largely remain a mystery for most of the game. As she slowly regains her memories, who she is and her impact on the larger story becomes much more clear. After skipping ahead 5 years in the future, Three Houses' story veers off in wildly different directions depending on which house you chose. Edelgard seeks to assert the Adrestian Empire's dominance and tear down the church. Dimitri looks to rebuild Fargus and overthrow Edelgard. Claude wants to open Fodlan's borders and end the nation's isolation from the rest of the world. There's also a fourth route in which you can side with Archbishop Rhea. Each of the 4 routes have distinct endings, encouraging repeat playthroughs. Three Houses changes up the way you play more than any entry yet. The game uses a calendar system to progress the story. Each week you can partake in a variety of activities across the monastery and battlefield, culminating with a story mission at the end of each month. How you spend your time was mostly up to you, although you had to attend to your teaching duties first and foremost. After your classes during the week, you had a number of points to spend on free time activities on the weekend, which included spending time with your students, fishing, gardening, or taking part in supplemental battles to level up. Combat in Three Houses felt like it was on a much larger scale thanks to the Switch's extra power. No longer were characters sprites on a grid, but were now fully rendered 3D models on a battlefield. Helping bring this bigger scale to life was the addition of battalions, small squads of soldiers that were assigned to individual characters. Battalions would grant the assigned character passive buffs, along with special moves called gambits. Gambits can range from healing allies to strong attacks, depending on your battalion, and could be further boosted depending on your positioning to allied troops. Three Houses once again forgoes the weapon triangle for a system called Combat Arts. A character would learn new weapon-based skills depending on their familiarity with a particular weapon type. The skills were stronger than a standard attack, but came at the cost of weapon degradation. You could repair weapons after battle, but if one broke during combat, you had to go without. If you made the wrong move and got a character killed, you no longer had to restart the entire battle over, but could instead use the Divine Pulse. This gave you the option to rewind a number of turns and try again. The ability to rewind turns helped to alleviate stress, especially during longer battles. Fire Emblem found critical and commercial success once again with Three Houses. It was lauded for its crisp visual style, strong storytelling, and addictive gameplay. Currently sitting at a Metacritic score of 89, only Fire Emblem Awakening garnered higher acclaim. During its quarterly earnings reports in September of 2019, Nintendo reported that Fire Emblem Three Houses had sold just shy of 2.3 million copies, making it the second best-selling entry in the franchise only 2 months after release. Fans praised the game as well, particularly for its strong cast of characters. The fan art community around Three Houses has seemingly been stronger than ever, with dozens of new pieces coming out daily. Longtime fans, however, lamented the game's simple map design and easy difficulty, even on the hardest setting. Three Houses was later patched to include a maddening mode, which substantially increased the challenge. Three Houses also took home accolades for Best Strategy Game and Player's Choice at the 2019 Game Awards. After teetering on the brink of cancellation, Fire Emblem has now established itself as a landmark Nintendo franchise. Its cumulative sales have overtaken pillar Nintendo series like Star Fox and Metroid. With each new entry outdoing the last, the sky's the limit for where Fire Emblem could go next. Video game remakes are not all that uncommon, and Fire Emblem has been no exception over the years. The first entry in the series, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, received not 1 but 3 total remakes. The first of these was called Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, which was released in Japan for the Nintendo Super Famicom on January 21st, 1994. While it includes the story from Shadow Dragon, it's considered by many to be the third mainline entry and not technically a remake. The game was broken up into 2 parts. The first part was a retelling of the original Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. The second was a direct sequel dealing with Marth confronting his old ally Hardin as he became drunk with power after ascending to the throne of Arcanea. The difficulty was also lowered in order to appeal to more players. Mystery of the Emblem was a huge success, with Famitsu awarding it a score of 33 out of 40 and going on to sell 776,000 copies. Mystery of the Emblem would get its own remake titled Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem, which was released for the Nintendo DS on July 15, 2010. Despite the fact that the West saw 5 Fire Emblem releases leading up to New Mystery of the Emblem, this remained a Japan exclusive. The story and gameplay remained largely the same outside of 2 new additions. The first of these was the ability for the player to create a customizable avatar to stand alongside Marth as the protagonist. The second of these new additions, which was also the most contentious, was the addition of a casual mode. Casual mode allowed the player to bring back fallen allies instead of them being gone for the duration of the game. This was highly contentious among staff members, as permadeath was a long-standing mechanic of the series. Casual mode's addition would, however, prove to be a boon to sales and future releases in the West. The last of these remakes was Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, which was released in North America for the Nintendo DS on February 16, 2009. This retold just the original story from Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Shadow Dragon added a few quality of life features to ease in new players, such as mid-battle saves, a display to showcase movement and attack range, as well as the ability to recruit new members if too many fell in battle. Despite Shadow Dragon's lack of originality, it was well received overall. Today, it sits at a Metacritic score of 81, and as of 2013 has sold over 500,000 copies worldwide. One of the more odd entries in the franchise, Fire Emblem Gaiden, also got the remake treatment nearly 2 decades after its original release. The remake, titled Fire Emblem Echoes: Shadows of Valentia, was released in North America for the Nintendo 3DS on May 19, 2017. This would be the first time audiences outside of Japan could experience the story. Echoes would remain true to the unique elements from Gaiden, even foregoing newer series staples like the weapon triangle. The game would also incorporate a number of new visual, gameplay, and storytelling enhancements, including a full English voice dub. Echoes was well received in the West, currently sitting at a Metacritic score of 81, and went on to have strong sales. The main knock against Echoes was its infinitely spawning enemies in later maps, which frustrated players and made battles drag out far longer than necessary. Over the years, Fire Emblem has been no stranger to supplemental games and odd experiments. Maybe the strangest of these is a game known as BS Fire Emblem, which served as a prequel to Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. BS was released in 1997 in Japan exclusively for the Satellaview, a peripheral add-on for the Super Famicom that would broadcast games via satellite. You would tune in during certain times of the day to play through the game's 4 episodes. It's been debated over the years if this is considered an official entry in the franchise, but as time has gone on, the events of the game are considered an extension of Mystery of the Emblem by fans and intelligence systems. Its content would eventually be rolled into New Mystery of the Emblem on the DS. After the series began to grow after the release of Fire Emblem Awakening, Nintendo sought out ways to expand the reach of the series via spin-off titles. The first of these was an RPG originally announced in 2013 as Shin Megami Tensei Cross Fire Emblem. It was a game meant to incorporate the best of both series into a compelling hybrid RPG. After not hearing anything for 2 years, the title eventually re-emerged as Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE. Instead of being a dark, hardcore RPG like fans were expecting, it was instead a colorful and playful one, akin to Atlus's Persona franchise. The story focused on teenagers trying to make a career in the Japanese entertainment scene, including many pop song performances. The gameplay was split between dungeon crawling and life sim aspects set in Tokyo's Shibuya and Harajuku districts. During combat, the player could call on the power of Fire Emblem characters, known here as Mirages. Familiar characters would include Chrom, Thracia, Sita, and Tiki. While not initially well received when it released on the Wii U in 2016, it's since grown a cult following and saw a re-release on Nintendo Switch on January 17, 2020. As Nintendo decided to start investing in the mobile market, beginning with Super Mario Run in 2016, they wanted to create more titles based on established franchises. In early 2017, Nintendo released Fire Emblem Heroes for mobile devices. Heroes was a free-to-play title with very simplified gameplay meant to be played in short bursts. It had a gacha-style system in which players could pay real money for the chance to acquire new characters to add to their roster. Fire Emblem Heroes included characters from nearly every entry in the series, including original ones, and is still well supported today. As of July 2019, Fire Emblem Heroes is Nintendo's most successful mobile game, raking in nearly $600 million. Fire Emblem characters also made cameo appearances in a limited-time event for another Nintendo-published mobile game called Dragalia Lost. Characters in this event included Marth, as well as 3 original characters from Fire Emblem Heroes, Alphonse, Veronica, and Fiorm. Of course, no successful franchise is complete without a Warriors-style spin-off. In the fall of 2017, Nintendo released Fire Emblem Warriors for the new 3DS and Nintendo Switch. It retains the Dynasty Warriors signature hack-and-slash combat while incorporating a number of Fire Emblem staples like the weapon triangle. The game's roster touted 23 characters at launch, with 9 additional coming later via DLC. The roster was dominated by characters from Fates and Awakening due to their massive popularity at the time, but was rounded out with series favorites Marth, Sita, Lyn, Tiki, and Anna. There are also 2 original characters, twin siblings Rowan and Liana. Despite weak representation across the franchise and an abundance of sword users, Fire Emblem Warriors is considered by many to be one of the very best Warrior-style spin-offs. As of April 2018, the game has sold over 1 million copies. Following up on the success of Fire Emblem Warriors and Three Houses, Nintendo released yet another Warrior-style spin-off in the form of Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes. This was released exclusively for the Nintendo Switch on January 24th, 2022. This entry took place in the same world as Three Houses, but puts you in the shoes of a new character named Shez. Like Three Houses, you choose one of the 3 houses to align with through the game. Although in this alternate timeline, Byleth, the protagonist of Three Houses, serves as the antagonist. The gameplay remained largely the same as Fire Emblem Warriors and was well received, sitting at an 81 out of 100 on Metacritic and selling over 1 million copies within its first 2 months of release. With Fire Emblem's growing popularity over the years and Intelligent Systems' penchant for referencing their own games, the series would expand outside the franchise itself. Of course, this all started with the inclusion of Marth and Roy in Super Smash Bros. Melee in 2001. Fire Emblem would continue to be well supported in Smash over the years. In 2005 Super Smash Bros. Brawl for the Wii, Marth would return as a fighter, with Roy being swapped out for Ike. All three would return in 2014 Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS, and would be joined by series newcomers Lucina, Robin, and Corrin. Finally, in 2018 Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, all six returned along with Chrom, serving as an Echo Fighter to Lucina. In 1996's Kirby Superstar for the Super Nintendo, you could spot the Falchion in the Great Cave Offensive, alongside items from a host of other Nintendo titles. In 2004's Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door for GameCube, young Toad is constantly breaking the fourth wall, talking about how much he loves playing Paper Mario on the Nintendo 64. But at one point he also mentions how much he's enjoying Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance. It's worth noting that Fire Emblem and Paper Mario are both developed by Intelligent Systems. If you had the appropriate amiibo, you could play as Marth, Ike, Robin, and Lucina in Intelligent Systems' 3DS strategy title, codenamed Steam. While the game was a commercial flop, it served as a great way to expand on the functionality of amiibo figures. With the success of Fire Emblem's mainline entries and series of spin-offs, what could be next for the series? As reported on an episode of Kinda Funny Games Daily in October of 2019, Imran Khan mentioned that there was supposed to be one last Fire Emblem remake for the 3DS. However, in the wake of soft sales for the Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story remake on 3DS, Nintendo scrapped this project. Reportedly, the work done on this remake may have been moved to a future project on Nintendo Switch, but as of late 2019, this is still unconfirmed. Many fans have theorized that it might have been a remake of Genealogy of the Holy War, considering it was never localized and shares several elements with Three Houses. The next mainline entry, Fire Emblem Engage, was originally announced in a Nintendo Direct in September of 2022 and is set to release on January 20th, 2023 exclusively for Nintendo Switch. In Engage, you play as Alir, a divine dragon who's been summoned to fend off the looming threat of the Fell Dragon. The main gimmick is the Engage mechanic, where characters summon and pair up with heroes from past Fire Emblem entries. Currently, pre-orders for Engage are vastly outpacing Three Houses, with a lot of positive buzz surrounding this upcoming release. Fire Emblem's journey of near death and rebirth is a remarkable one, to say the least. It's amazing to think how the developer that popularized the strategy RPG subgenre in the first place nearly killed the franchise that started it all. But rather than denigrate Intelligent Systems' failings, it's worth celebrating their achievements. What could have been one final game turned into one of the most cherished entries in the series. What's clear is the passion from the fans who love it and the dedication from the team who makes it. As long as Fire Emblem continues to burn bright, the next adventure won't be far off.